Welcome to How Borders Tear Apart Nations. It's wild to think about, like imagine if, instead of politics, the lines on a world map were all based on shared cultures and languages and history. It'd be a completely different world, right? Completely different. Yeah, today we're going to look at the stories of nations that are split apart by borders, and we're going to see how those lines cut through the heart of cultural groups and the impact that has on people's lives. Yeah, for sure.
We'll start in Asia, where you see this contrast between cultural unity and political division, like really clearly.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the most interesting examples is the Malay world, which is this super vibrant cultural sphere that's divided between Malaysia and Indonesia. And you have all these people who share a common heritage and traditions, and even languages that are so similar, they're almost like dialects.
Oh wow, so they can almost understand each other.
Yeah, basically they can usually understand the gist of what someone is saying, even if they don't speak the exact same language. And the differences we see today are mostly because of the influence of their old colonial rulers.
Oh, so like who colonized them way back when?
Exactly, so you had the British in Malaysia and the Dutch in Indonesia.
Wow, so something that happened centuries ago still shapes how people talk today. It's crazy.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. Do you think things would be different if they were like one nation?
Oh, that's a tough question. It's hard to say for sure.
Yeah, but just imagine the potential, you know. The whole economic and political landscape would be completely different.
Right. Of course there would be challenges too, like how would they balance their unique identities within this one big nation?
Yeah, that's a good point. It makes you think about all those what-ifs of history.
Totally. Speaking of complicated histories, the relationship between China and Taiwan, that's another example of a modern-day political division with some deep roots.
Yeah, you have Taiwan, which represents like the remnants of pre-communist China, and that adds a whole other dimension to what it means to be a nation.
Like, what does it even mean to be a nation when there's no clear answer about who's in control politically? It's like their whole identity is constantly being, like, negotiated and redefined.
Exactly.
Let's move to another part of Asia, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan. They share this Persian heritage, but they're separated by a border that empires imposed back in the 1800s.
Yeah, the British and the Russian empires, they just drew a line right through the region's people who have lived together for centuries. And even today, a lot of Afghans and Tajiks feel closer to each other than they do to people in their own countries, even though there's this political boundary between them.
That's powerful. It shows how lines on a map can just cut right through communities.
Yeah, it's really impactful.
Now on the other hand, you have a place like Bhutan, this small nation in the Himalayas, that stayed independent even when a lot of Tibet was absorbed by China.
How did they manage that?
Bhutan is a really interesting case.
They basically made a choice to develop their own unique cultural identity that was separate from Tibet. They really emphasized their traditions and language and religion, and that helped them solidify their independence.
So they basically created a border in people's minds, like a border of culture, that was stronger than a physical boundary.
Exactly, it shows how powerful culture can be in shaping a nation.
Yeah, for sure. But then you have situations where it gets even more complex, like with the Lao people.
Oh yeah, the Lao people are actually a bigger group in Thailand than they are in Laos itself.
Wow, it makes you wonder what a nation really is.
Like, do you need your own country to be a nation?
A nation without a country, that's a new one.
Right.
We see something similar with Mongolia. You have Inner Mongolia and Outer Mongolia.
Exactly. In Inner Mongolia, which is part of China, you have a mix of cultures because a lot of Han Chinese have moved there.
But Outer Mongolia, which is independent, has kept a strong Mongolian identity, even preserving their unique vertical writing system.
I love that script, it's beautiful.
And it represents their heritage and their determination to keep their culture alive.
But these divisions don't just impact culture.
Right.
Oh, definitely not. They can also lead to political problems and even conflict.
Like, look at the Azeri people. They're a Turkic group split between Azerbaijan and Iran.
Right, and that division has caused some serious issues in the past.
It has at times. It's led to conflict because of those nationalist feelings on both sides of the border.
It really shows how flashpoints for historical grievances. It's sad, but it's true.
And unfortunately, when we talk about conflict and borders, we have to talk about India and Pakistan.
The partition of India and Pakistan in 1947 was driven by religious differences, and it led to one of the biggest mass migrations in history. It's a tragic event. Communities and families were torn apart.
It really was, and the effects are still felt today. Then there's the Bengal region, which is now split between Bangladesh and India. They speak the same language.
Bengali, but even that hasn't stopped cultural and political differences from popping up. It's a good reminder that national identities are always changing, they're shaped by history and politics and economics and all sorts of things.
Even when people share a language, they can end up with distinct cultural and political identities over time.
It seems like borders are kind of like living things, always changing the world around them.
All right, let's shift our focus to Europe, often considered the birthplace of the nation-state.
We'll see how these dynamics play out there.
What's interesting about Europe is that even though the idea of the nation-state came from there, the lines between nations and states are still kind of blurry.
It's full of nations that are divided by borders, just like in Asia.
So Europe's not as straightforward as it seems.
Not at all, it's a lot more complex than that.
So Europe is like this place we think of with strong national identities and, clear borders?
Yeah.
But it's actually way more complicated.
It is.
And a classic example of that is Germany and Austria.
They have a shared language and culture and history, but they were kept apart during Germany's unification in the 1800s for political reasons.
So it was more about power struggles than like a lack of shared identity.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that borders aren't always drawn because of cultural differences.
Sometimes it's about who's in charge and what they want.
And speaking of shifting power, the relationship between Romania and Moldova is another interesting case.
I've always wondered about Moldova, are they a separate nation or part of Romania?
Well, Moldova was once part of Romania, but over time has developed its own identity.
It even claims to have a separate language from Romanian.
Wait, a separate language? But aren't they basically the same people?
Well, it's tricky.
They share a history and a lot of cultural stuff, but the political and social situation in Moldova has led to this unique sense of national identity.
It really highlights how fluid these concepts are.
National identity isn't fixed.
It can change based on all sorts of factors.
Yeah, even though they come from the same background, they've kind of grown in different directions like branches on a tree.
That's a good way to put it.
And language seems to play a big role in these national identities, like the dispute between Bulgaria and North Macedonia.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a perfect example of how sensitive these things can be. Bulgaria claims that the Macedonian language is just a dialect of Bulgarian, which basically means they think North Macedonians are part of the Bulgarian nation.
Wow, that must be frustrating for North Macedonians to have their language and history basically rejected by another country.
It cuts to the core of their identity. And then you have Albania and Kosovo that adds another layer to this idea of a divided nation.
Right. Kosovo, which is mostly Albanian, declared independence from Serbia, and that created another split within the Albanian nation.
It's crazy how these divisions can impact so many things, from international relations to everyday life.
Yeah. They're not just abstract ideas, they have real consequences for people's freedom, their opportunities, their sense of belonging.
The island of Cyprus, divided between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, is another example.
It's like the island itself is broken, reflecting the division between the two communities.
Do you think a place like that can ever truly heal?
It's tough. Reconciliation is possible, but it takes a lot of work to address historical grievances and find ways to bridge those divides.
It's a challenge a lot of countries face in Ireland and Northern Ireland.
That's another example of how colonialism's legacy continues to shape things.
Yeah, it's a complicated and painful history with deep divisions, right?
But it also shows that even with division, there's always hope for reconciliation.
Let's move beyond Europe now and talk about the Arab world.
It's a region that spans many countries.
Yeah, and it's interesting because they have this incredible cultural unity, shared language, history, and religion, but it's all broken up into these separate states, mostly because of colonialism. It makes you wonder, what would have happened if those colonial borders were never drawn? Would there be a unified Arab nation?
How would history be different? That's a question that's still debated. The impact of those borders is huge, though it's affected everything from politics to economics, and it still fuels conflict in the region.
And it's not just the Middle East that's dealing with this. Africa has similar issues because of how European powers drew those borders.
Absolutely, and you see the consequences today. There are so many ethnic groups split across multiple countries, like the Yoruba people in Nigeria, Benin, and Togo, or the Somali people divided between Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya.
So the borders just ignore the people who actually live there?
Pretty much, and that creates all sorts of problems. It makes it hard to deal with shared issues, manage resources, and build a sense of unity.
And then there's the Bengali people split between Bangladesh and India. It's interesting because even with a shared language and culture, they've developed different national identities.
Yeah. And that shows how complex nationhood is. It's not just about language or ethnicity, it's about shared experiences, political systems, and a feeling of belonging that develops over time. Even when people share a common root, history can lead them down different paths, creating distinct national identities. It's like borders, even when they're arbitrary, end up shaping how people see themselves and the world around them.
It's amazing how these lines someone drew on a map, they can completely change history and how we see ourselves.
It makes you realize that we don't even think about borders most of the time, but they're more than just lines. They represent real divisions.
Yeah, and sometimes those divisions come from conflict or political maneuvering, but there are always consequences for the people who live there.
Definitely, and it's important to remember that it's not always so clear-cut either.
Yeah, you have places like the Malay world where things are kind of blurry and people have this strong cultural connection, even though there are political borders.
Right, it's like the human story is always more complicated than what you see on a map.
For sure. We see it in how languages develop and cultures change and how national identities are always being shaped by history.
Exactly.
And I think that's a key takeaway from today. Borders might separate us physically.
Yeah, but they don't erase our shared history or culture or the connections that bring people together.
I agree. What do you think would happen if we stopped focusing so much on political borders and started focusing more on what makes us human? You know, like what if we focused on the things that unite us?
Instead of the things that divide us.
That's a really interesting thought. It would definitely change how we think about nations and identities and where we fit in the world. Right, it might even lead to more peace and cooperation. I hope so, I really do. So, as we wrap up our look at how borders tear apart nations, I want you to look at a world map with fresh eyes.
Yeah. What connections can you see? What stories of resilience and shared humanity are hidden beneath those lines?
Let us know what you think in the comments. What examples really stuck with you? What did you learn from our conversation? And don't forget to subscribe and share this with anyone who likes to explore the world and all its complexities.
Thanks for joining us.